know, who's chairman of our planning and development committee, will start off, and then she'll hand over to Val Conway, who's acting as a consultant for the town council in respect of this site. And that's my phone, I do apologise. So right, off you go, Jess, thank you.
Okay, who's got the presentation, the slides? Who's showing the slides? Is that Leslie who's going to be doing that, or is that going to be Val Conway?
And that's Val, Jess.
Okay, Val, do you mind bringing up the slides? You're muted at the moment. So while Val's doing it, let me just explain about the reason for having this meeting. At the start of the last meeting, which was a confidential meeting, there were some people who were members of the public who were concerned about the fact that we were going to be going into a confidential meeting in order to be discussing the police station site. The reason why it was a confidential meeting is that we were discussing information that was commercially confidential and could have an impact on, if it went into the public domain, it could actually have an ability on our ability to acquire the site. So what we decided to do, because we knew that people were interested in this, widely interested in this, we decided, let's have a public meeting where we don't discuss what is commercially confidential, but we do present on what is in the public domain, but which a lot of people don't know because they haven't been embroiled in this for a long time, as many of us have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover what is introductory historical information, so everybody can be up to speed on what's happened in the past about this police station site and where we are now. And then I'm going to turn over to Val, and Val is technically expert in development, and she'll talk to you about the whole process that's involved in trying to acquire the station.
Hang on a minute. Hang on. I'm trying to log into a council meeting really quickly because I'm supposed to be at one of them as well. Right, the people this weekend. Hang on.
Okay, whoever that is.
Could you mute yourself, please, Paula?
Mute yourself, whoever that is.
It's Paula.
Yeah,
Okay.
hang on a minute. Just sorry.
Do you see the slides now, Jessica?
Okay, so first I'm going to give you the timeline. Back in 2014, it became apparent to our county councillor, Michael Ladd, that the PCC was going to be downsizing all of the police facilities and starting to sell them off. And so what he told the town council about this, and so we began the whole process of investigating whether or not we could buy the police and fire station sites together. We did a feasibility study, we looked at the whole thing, and we said, actually, we shouldn't be doing this at that time because the planning policies weren't in our favor. And if we did, we would be investing an awful lot of money, selling off a lot of other assets, all of the restricted place houses, and we would actually buy something that we wouldn't be able to control at that time. And then in 2017, shortly before the police put the fire and police station sites on the market, because they were marketed jointly by the police, Michael Ladd and Leslie Beaver had a meeting with the PCC's agent, which was Carter Jonas. Carter Jonas was responsible for marketing them. And the ask was, can we get this for less than market residential value? And they were told no. We are expecting to get 1.7 million pounds for the site, and we're not going to give it to you for less. And in fact, as a matter of law, the police have to get best value for this, and that's best market value. So even if we wanted to help you, we couldn't. So in June of 2017, the site was put on the market, the two sites, police and fire. There were two bids, and they were both withdrawn. And the reason that they were withdrawn is because both developers had basically a design template. And they were told by the planning officers that you cannot use that design template on that site because the town council had commissioned the Ingleton Wood Design Framework. And basically, once that framework was adopted by the town, the town council as part of its strategy, the planning authority was saying, we want high quality design for that site. Then Hasto Housing Association came in. They were the third highest bidder. They made a bid. And again, it was rejected by the police. It wasn't rejected by Suffolk County Council, which owned the fire station site, but it was rejected by the police. Some time elapsed. And then in December, early December of 2019, the police applied for outline planning permission for 9 open market units. The reason they did an outline planning application is because basically once they got that, they would be sure to be able to sell it for residential use. And so it took some of the risk out of it, of marketing it. Well, the town council decided that they would do everything within their power to oppose that application. And we submitted a lengthy response. But in conversation with the planning authority, one of the things that we realized is that the only way to prevent this site from getting residential use, which was guaranteed, is if we could get it designated as an asset of community value. So in a very short time, we put together a proposal to nominate it as an asset of community value. And that meant following certain guidelines that are issued by East Suffolk District Council. We had to tick various boxes and make a convincing case. And then some time elapsed and we got that designation. And that was probably the single most important thing that we did in this process, because that threw a big spanner into the works. Now, in getting that designation, we had to show that there was a use, which was a viable use, potentially, and where there had been community consultation on that use. And the only use that was evident at that time was for an environmental learning study. In 2019, when the Boating Lake feasibility study was done, there was a community consultation around the boating lake and what people wanted to see there. And there was an online survey of residents, and roughly 150, 160 people thereabout answered it. And 45% were interested in having an environmental study center in the town. So we had consultation. We knew it could be viable because we had done a lot of research with the Geography Fieldwork Academy at that town, which would have been a major user of it. We put it into the application. And then in October 2020, outline planning consent was refused. That was the great victory. Now we have until the 14th of January to make a bid to buy the site. On the 14th of January, the 6-month moratorium period during which a community group of any kind can make a bid for the site, it ends. So that's our deadline. And that's what we've been working to. Should we or should we not make a bid? Could I have the next slide? Now, as we've been doing all of this work on the police station site, we've also been working on the neighborhood plan. And we developed several policies which have an impact on the use of that site. These policies, by the way, are out for consultation right now. And if you haven't given us your view of them, please, would you give us your view of them? Because community consultation on these policies is essential. We have to show that people want us to have these policies. So the first policy says that if a site is an asset of community value, then if it needs to be developed in order to make that primary community use viable, it's possible to do that. But the only other ways you can use that site is through building some affordable and or market housing. So that's about the use of the site once our neighborhood plan is adopted. Okay. We also have a policy which says that if that site is developed for market housing, it is only for principal residents. And then we have a third policy which says that so long as our neighborhood plan is in place, that's 18 years, this site is appropriate for alternative community uses to a police station that could be subsidized by permanently affordable housing provided by a community-led housing group in accordance with the first policy. And if the site is developed, it has to be high quality design which is consistent with the Ingleton Wood design framework. And it should have a pedestrian right-of-way which links the Millennium Field car park through the fire and police station sites to Station Yard. So those are all the planning policies that will be applicable to this site. And Val will explain to you why these planning policies are important to the purchase of the site and the future use of the site. Now, about 3 months ago, the town council considered for the first time, well, should we make a bid? Well, you don't know whether or not you should make a bid unless you know how much money you should be bidding for that site. So what we decided is we would commission a residual land use study, which Val will explain. And in doing so, we said it has to be delivered before the end of December, so we can make a decision before the moratorium period ends, which is January 14th. And we also decided, as a practical matter, let's base it on an environmental study center, because you have to have a use in mind, because the use in mind tells you what revenues, what it would cost to build, what revenues can be generated, and that gives you a starting point for negotiations in your residual land use study. And the reason why we chose the Environmental Study Center was very simple. We knew that the planning authority would consider it a community use, because they already had said it was a community use in our ACD application. And we also had done some community consultation on it. Once the land is acquired, it can be used for any purpose that works and is compliant with our neighborhood plan. So primary community, and it could be supported or subsidized by affordable housing and or market housing. Everything depends upon what is going to be viable in the future. So at this point, what I'm going to do is turn over to Val so she can explain to you the process.
Thank you, Jessica. First of all, I've been asked to just let everybody know a little bit about who I am and who we are. My name is Valerie Conway. I'm a chartered surveyor. I've been working in the field of property and development for over 30 years, and my life is all about development, viability and delivery of projects. I'm a lecturer as part of that role for Cardiff University in their Masters in Planning and Development on matters of viability, and also for Oxford Brookes University. And I've also given evidence at a number of public inquiries around land use, valuation and viability. So that's who I am. My colleague, Debbie Lloyd, who has the same background and qualifications as I am, is also on this meeting because we work together. So it's important we both know what's going on. No further ado, I'll take you through where we are. So the information I was given on which to look at land values, land uses, and how to go about trying to secure the site for community use was the principle of an environmental studies centre, a sort of community option for the land, but not necessarily the final design, the final option, or anything of that nature. The the Environmental Studies Centre was looked at from an economic point of view, by a fellow consultant working on it who has looked at all the different elements of the facilities, formal and informal education, ancillary uses, commercial services that benefit the community, in order to look at a mix that would represent a viable community use, that would generate an income to ensure that it's not reliable on grant income, could cover all its costs, and could generate some value to help pay for the land. So mixed use is very, very important to the sustainability long term and to that viability argument, but I think it's very clear that nothing is as yet set in stone. So the types of things this development could encompass would include commercial uses such as a bike hire and repair facility, a laundrette, which could be used to support the centre itself, but also by third parties to generate an income. The learning centre itself will generate an income because it would run courses both for A-level students and also for private sector hirers who want to run environmental courses. There's a particular amount of environmental learning needed in the planning arena at the moment. And also some accommodation for rental, again to generate an income, for affordable occupation by young people and singles, and also accommodation to support the Environmental Studies Centre use so that those visiting can actually stay, and they would also then benefit Southwold as a whole by spending money in the town. So, to buying the land. This is the bit where I really come in. You can't do anything with this site unless you can actually buy it from the PCC. If you don't buy the site, the opportunity for this land to fulfil its intention as an asset of community value isn't going to be achieved. Now, the PCC, as has already been pointed out, is obliged to secure best price. Now, that is the best price reasonably obtainable on the open market for the land. So they are under this obligation because, like the town council, they're a public body and it's public money. And the ownership of any land has to secure best price to make sure that public money is not being abused and to make sure that the public purse is being protected. Now, the PCC have a history with this site, as has been outlined by Councillor James, looking at a value based on residential development, for which planning permission has now been refused and which is not in line with planning policy. So let's have a little look at that. We need to make an offer for this land, and we need to make an offer based on something that actually works. So it has to be based on what a community project can afford and what an ongoing future community use, whatever that is, can support through the development. So we needed to get a picture of that, which is why we've looked at the Environmental Studies Centre. Ultimately, though, the bid for the site will only succeed if the PCC accepts the offer and agrees to it, because they own the land. And as for all land purchases, this will be a matter for negotiation. So, what are their aspirations? Now, an awful lot of people ask me, well, what's the value of that piece of land? Land does not have an intrinsic value of itself. Land only has a value based on what you can actually use it for. So I can't say that land's worth £10 and that land's worth £100 or whatever. Land is worth what somebody is prepared to pay for it based on what they can actually do with it.
You know, what you might be able to hear is there's a Zoom meeting going on about what to do with the old police office.
Shall I carry on?
Oh, wait, let's wait.
But no. Incidentally, I put a diary in the post to you today, but
You could ask the member of the public to mute.
Everybody's muted who's on here. Yes.
Ian,
There's one.
it's Margaret Beckett.
Hang on, I hear my name.
Yes, Margaret. We can
Hello?
hear you on. We can hear you on the Zoom.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
You need to mute.
I thought it was muted.
Well, it isn't. I can assure you.
Oh, Simon, I'm awfully sorry.
Oh, don't worry, but we can hear you. That's the point.
I don't want you to hear me.
Uh,
I don't know how to mute it.
well, on the
Um,
left hand, on your screen, on the left hand button, there should be a mute.
At the bottom of your screen on the left
all I
hand,
can see is pictures of people.
Yeah, on your screen, when you go into your screen, you should see
Don't
on
worry.
the
Margaret, I'll
left-hand
ring you
side.
back.
Okay.
Bye. You won't hear me now because I've rung off.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Shall I carry on?
yes, please.
So people will say, how much is that land worth? Well, it doesn't have an intrinsic value. Land is valued based on what you can actually use it for. Now, the PCC's position is that they've obviously thought in the past that this site has potential for residential development. So they would say, okay, the value is based on residential development. For residential development, what we would normally do is carry out a thing called a residual value appraisal, where we look at the total value of everything you could build on the site. So if it was there 9 units, what that's worth, all of the costs, including the profit the developer would want to be paid for building those units, and you take all the costs away from all the value, and what's left is called a residual value, and that's how much somebody could afford to pay for the land for a residential use. So it would depend on how many units, whether they're deliverable, how quickly you could secure them, etc., to work out what that value is. Well, Southwold's got a very, very high value for housing and housing land. There's big money to be made if you can secure planning permission for residential development. But with regard to the PCC site, the question we have to ask is, can that value actually really be realised? Is it realistic? Is it ever going to happen? When we're looking at a community use, the approach is slightly different, because we're not building something we're going to sell at the end where we can take all the costs off and work out how much we can pay for the land. What we're looking at is how much money we've got in surplus income to support the payment for the land. And this would assume a loan, although it's not necessarily based on a loan. It's saying, if we had to borrow the money, could we afford it based on the income? So we would look at the total income that can be generated, take the running costs off. What does that leave us, and how much does that let us afford to spend on that land? So it's a different sum. And the income generated will depend on the final mix of uses. And to give us an understanding of how this might compare to the expectations that the PCC might have had in the past, we've looked at the Environmental Study Centre. And what we've looked at is what it does, how it might work, and how viable it is in generating an income. So we've used that as the basis to start our consideration of how to move forward in negotiations. Now, the planning context is really important, because the question is it realistic for the PCC to be able to expect residential use and therefore residential value on the site? Now, if it was, they'd have to do that because they have an obligation to do so because of the aspect of protecting the public purse. But is it really? Now, at the moment, the site is designated as an asset of community value for 5 years and potentially another 5 after that. Therefore, realistically, it's not available at the moment for residential development. It's also designated in the emerging neighbourhood plan for community and supporting ancillary uses. So those other uses are only there to support the viability and enable the delivery of a community use. If that neighbourhood plan is adopted, that policy can remain in place for 18 years. So there's no real prospect of a purely market residential development of the site for some time. And even if there was, the value would have to take into account matters such as the principal residence policy, so it couldn't be sold to people who were looking for holiday accommodation, which is something that drives a lot of value in Southwold. There's also constraints. It would need to comply with the Ingleton Wood framework. Again, we're looking at the quality of development, provide the pedestrian paths, relate to the conservation area in AONB. So there's a huge amount of reasons why it's not really realistic for the PCC to expect a full residential value for that site. I think that train has left the station, it's gone. Whether they accept that remains to be seen. Planning permission has been refused. So, and we're also aware there could be some contamination because the ground was previously used as a railway station. Now, all of those things significantly impact on who might be in the market to buy the site, how much they might pay, and whether or not it's realistic to assume residential development value. And we don't think it is based on those facts. So who else might buy the site? Because if they do have to go to the market, if the PCC has to put it on the market to prove they've got best value, who's actually going to buy it, knowing all those things? Because anybody looking to buy the site will check out the planning permission, check out the planning policy context, look at the site, look at its history, and understand as much as they can before they make an offer. Now, normally for a site like this, we'd be looking at local and regional developers, because Southwold's an attractive place, there would be money to be made, and they would be saying, right, where's my next site coming from to keep my staff employed and to keep my business turning over? However, because this is not likely to be available in the foreseeable future, it's very unlikely to be of attraction to those typical buyers. So that part of the market that we would normally expect to buy the site is likely to be put off unless they make an offer conditional on getting planning permission, which is very likely to fail given the history and the fact that it's failed already. So they would then have to wait to see if that process could secure a planning permission, and if not, any such a bid would fail. So again, that's unlikely to come to fruition. Now, there may be people looking at alternative community uses that would be within the planning constraints for the site. But again, those community uses would have to show a viable development that's not reliant on grant funding, that generates enough money to buy the site. And if it's for a community use and it's a use that's supported publicly by the community, all very well, that fits in with the requirements. The other party who might be interested in this site is a little more interesting. There's an awful lot of people looking for places to put money at the moment. People who are wealthy are not getting any interest from bank accounts and some other forms of investment because the interest rate is at an all-time low. So investors who've got money to spend might gamble on a long-term gain. They might say, well, Southwold is a fantastic location. It's very desirable. Maybe I want to get a foothold in there. Maybe I'm prepared to buy it and sit on it and wait until such time as the community use has gone away and I can go back to a residential value and make a small killing. And maybe the land value will go up more than the interest I can get from anything else in that period of time. So there could be somebody out there who's just going to say, I'll buy it. I'd like a foothold in Southwold, but they've got to be prepared to have very patient money to sit and wait, and also be prepared to be seen to prevent that site being used for the benefit of Southwold and the community, which is what it's designated for. So the PCC, in order to negotiate with them, we have to understand how they might feel and how they might think. I think they're going to be disappointed. I suspect they've already been disappointed by the planning permission being refused and the planning context, if anything, moving them further away from the prospect of making a lot of money for residential development on the site. They may want to, or feel they have to, test the market to prove best value and to see if there is anyone out there who wants a long-term slice of Southwold and is prepared to sit on it even though they can't do anything with it for 20 years, and that would not be to the benefit of the community.
Check that.
So if the site is bought by an investor, the community benefit could be lost for the long term. And of course, whoever does that is not necessarily going to make themselves popular, wouldn't necessarily stop everybody. So in negotiating, what we need to do is make an offer, have a discussion with the PCC, tell them we understand the position, make sure they understand the position, and basically say to them, we want this to work for Southwold. It's got community value because that's the planning designation. We want to make a fair offer. We want to work with you, not against you. And we would hope that both being public sector organisations, we can reach an agreement that does something positive for Southwold. So we're going to make an offer on that basis and try and try and have a sensible, open discussion. But there's no guarantee, obviously, that any offer or reasonable offer that's affordable could be accepted. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee they won't take it to the market. So there is a risk that the site could be lost to another bidder. We very much hope it won't be, but there is clearly a risk. So what happens if they turn us down, they refuse to accept the offer, or they choose to retain the site? Well, I think we have to keep a dialogue with them, keep an open discussion, make sure we've got an offer on the table at all times, because if they put it to the market, might not get any offers. We don't know. It might not. We've got to review and restate our offer from time to time, making sure that we're clear in the intention to buy the land and the intention for it to be developed for community use. We also have to watch the market, because there's a lot going on at the moment with COVID-19, with the final implementation of Brexit. There's a lot of commentators suggesting there could be a downturn, which may change their attitude to a sale, because at the end of the day, you are the bird in the hand rather than two birds who might not exist in a bush and who may well have flown away. That's really all I've got to say at this point. I think I'll hand back now to the Mayor to manage any questions, but I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Val, thank you. And Jessica, thank you ever so much for that presentation. It's important now for everyone to have their video on, please, so I can see you. And then if you sort of wave to me, I'll try and bring you in. That said, I have a number of people down that I recognise, and I made an alphabetical list, and I thought I might start at the bottom of the list and sort of invite you to ask a question and see where we got to by doing it that way. I'm not saying you won't be able to come in and ask a question later, Bill, but I'm going to start off with you, Bill Steele, and say, do you want to ask a question of Val on the basis of what you've heard tonight?
Thank you. Actually, I was going to ask the council, what is the funding process going to be? I mean, how is the Southwold Town Council going to fund a possible purchase of this site?
Right, okay. Can we leave that in abeyance for the moment, please, Bill? Because the first decision is to decide whether we put in a bid or not. And of course, okay, we may decide not to do that next week. And it will all be based upon where money's coming from as well, if we do choose to go down that route. But I'm not invalidating the question, but it's what's in front of the cart at the moment. All right.
Fine.
But somebody else might come back and help me on that one as well. Ian Small, sir, anything you'd like to ask?
Yeah. Do we have any indication of what the PCC's kind of pain threshold is? I mean, before we go into negotiation, when they've already had a 1.7 million notional number in their head, do we have any sense of what their likely threshold is going to be before we even step forward?
Can I answer that, Ian?
Yes, please.
We do, but that's not something that we can disclose in this meeting. We have an indication.
That's fine. That's really all needed to know. Are we talking about a blank sheet of paper, or how far down the line have we got with initial discussion? So that's fine. I don't need a number, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
We are, Ian, trying to keep confidential information out of this tonight, simply because we won't have a negotiating stance if we make it public at the moment. That's the primary reason. It's not being evasive or lacking transparency, but we've got to try and make these decisions on the basis of pragmatism, I suppose. Right. David Palmer's next on my list that I can see. Anything you'd like to ask, David?
Yes, thank you. The purpose of this meeting appears to be to gather feedback from the town residents about whether we should make a bid for it or not.
No, sir, it's not. It's to give people in the town an indication and information as to what the process is for making a bid on the police station site.
Can I follow up?
You can widen it if you want to, David, but that isn't the primary reason for the meeting.
Okay. We are being asked that we've been described very ably, I have to say, the process. I won't pretend to understand all the ins and outs of it, but I get the general drift. Where does that get us? Because A, we don't know what we're putting in for and what it'll cost and so on. I mean, it might be an environmental centre, it might be supported by affordable, so-called affordable housing with all those sorts of bits and pieces. So we don't know what we're going to use the land for specifically, therefore how much it will cost, and therefore whether it's worthwhile putting a bid in. So I'm a little bit confused as to the aims and objectives of this consultation. Thank you.
Right. Well, as I'm going to bring Val in on that one as well in a minute, but just to re-emphasize what I've said, this is information for the general public, so they are aware of the process that is going on. And Town Council next week, in its confidential discussions, will have to decide whether to make a bid or not. That's as clear as I can be on it. Thank you.
Sorry, I do have to. It's all very well for the Town Council to make a decision, but if it isn't able to make a consultation about the decision to spend an unknown amount of money for an unknown purpose, on what basis is the council going to make their recommendation and decisions? Why bother with this show, in other words?
Thank you, David. I think that's a very important point. Having decided whether we bid or not, that moves us on to the next stage. What do we put on the site? There's no reason why we can't make a decision on to bid or not without actually having a clear indication of what it's going to be used for. I mean, I don't want to just throw this out, but it could simply be a car park for a few years.
Excuse me, Ian, can I just?
Yes, but Jess.
Yeah, I think I can address the question slightly differently from the way Ian has, and I think Val will also bring in some perspective on this. The town council's power to help the town, to help regenerate the town, really is based at the end of the day on land. You know, who owns the land in the town? And the more land we own, the more ability we have to use it to help to regenerate the town. And the neighborhood plan is very clear on what the priority land uses for the town should be. And that's emerged out of years of consultation. And those priorities should be affordable housing, which you might need some market housing to subsidize, and community use and employment land. That's what all in the neighborhood plan. So if we're able to acquire this land, it gives us the power to do good for the town. And everything that's involved financially to make that possible is a down the road decision, or is part of the whole process of putting something together, a package together. But I'll turn over to Val now, because I think she has a different way of looking at this that could be helpful.
Thank you. On this point, you're absolutely right. It's a bit of a cart and a horse one, and it would be brilliant to have the absolute ideal, fully understood, fully consulted scheme to be able to use to make an offer that we all knew was going to go ahead. But we're not in that position, and we have a deadline. And we have a deadline in which we've got to decide whether to make an offer or not. So the process has been to identify a reasonable, sensible community use that already has some backing, that already exists, that is a proposal that has some support to say, how much can this afford and is it viable? Because we need to have a viable community use in order for that site to work for the town and to provide the town council with the community benefits in the long term. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to be the final finished solution, it is a solution that enables us to say, what is a realistic community use? What is the realistic types of level of value a community use could support? Let's see where that takes us, and let's see if that enables us to negotiate for this site. Now, if we get an agreed figure, and we come back with a figure that the PCC is prepared to accept, that the town council can then consider again, that figure would then be looked at in the context of the community value overall, the community benefit the site brings, and whether or not realistically this community use or any other can support that figure. So it's a difference, there's a two-stage process. There's a deadline, do we make an offer? And if we do, it's got to be a realistic offer, and we've really got to be wanting to buy the site. If we then get a figure that both parties feel they can recommend, that comes back for another thought to see how reasonable that is within that wider community context and what might be needed, possibly for this community use, possibly for others, to make that actually deliverable and workable. So I think we're at a point in the process where it would be great if we had the final solution. We haven't got it, but we have got to actually get on with this, or the opportunity could be lost for the community all round. There will be another chance to say, okay, if we've got agreement, does it work or doesn't it work, and where do we get the money from? And that can be looked at that stage. I hope that helps.
It helps amazingly, Val, thank you. I would say it also creates a further opportunity for community engagement and consultation, and that would be inherent in the next phase anyway, once a decision has been made to purchase or not. Okay, Mrs. Reddington, Vic, would you like to ask a question? I missed you out on my alphabetical list, I'm sorry.
He's gone.
He's gone. Righto. Okay, fine. That's an opportunity for me to say as well, please, remember we are recording this session.
He's come back now.
He's come back. Vic, are you with us? Would you like to ask a question? I'll unmute you. There you go.
No, I don't have a question at the moment, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I go up to Mr. and Mrs. Hemming then. Nigel, would you like to say anything? No, I take that to be a no. I'll unmute you as well. I can't hear you. Sorry, Nigel. The opportunity to come back will be there in a minute. All right. How about to Catherine Kirk?
I wasn't necessarily planning to ask anything, but I think it would be helpful to start imagining a vision that the community can start thinking about. It always helps to have a view. So I'm very much on the side of the earlier speaker who said, you know, we need perhaps a little bit more vision and clarity. I mean, what we don't want, I would take it, is that we purchase this land, we've got it, and then in the end, we're really not very clear what we're going to do with it. And there could be financial implications for the town council if it lies dormant for too long.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that observation. And Caroline Kirk, would you like to ask a question? Caroline, you've frozen and you're muted. Okay, this isn't a very good way of doing it. I'm going to ask for waves in a minute, but I'll just go to the top of the list.
I don't need to ask a question. I didn't
at the moment. Okay, fine. I'll keep going with my list because we're nearly at the top of it. Bill Hancock.
Yes, thank you. A couple of quick questions. One, does the bid commit you to purchase? If you make a bid, have you got to follow through and purchase, or can you withdraw?
Well, I'm going to hand this to Val, but presumably it's got to be accepted before we can follow it through. Val?
Okay.
Yes.
Second question. You mentioned site contamination, possible site contamination. How does that factor into the value? And third question, is that site in a floodplain? Because you're talking about a long-term investment. So I just wondered if that would affect the value if it was.
Val?
The first question, making a bid does not commit you to purchase. The process is, for buying land, that one person makes an offer and the offer is either accepted or rejected. If you reach a point where an offer is accepted, the law of property is unlike any other situation where offer and acceptance constitutes a contract. For the law of property, it has to be a written contract. So once you've made an offer and had it accepted, until you've written it down and signed a contract, you're not bound to it. And either party can pull out until that contract has been exchanged and then finally completed. So there is a protection in there, and it enables particularly people in a public sector environment to make an offer and then take that offer back through the proper decision-making processes for consideration. So if the offer's been accepted, you don't actually have to go ahead until you've taken it through your own internal processes and got it signed off. And then you can move forward with the actually legally binding contractual relationship. Coming to the second point, in terms of contamination, contamination will affect the value of a site depending upon whether that contamination has to be dealt with and how it is dealt with. So one of the things you would do as part of the process going forward, at the point at which you've had your offer accepted, before you've completed, is to do a ground condition survey to make sure you understand exactly what is involved, exactly what is there if there is anything there, and how you would deal with it. Now, how you deal with contamination is different for if you're building a commercial property or something like a learning centre than it is if you're building houses. Sometimes there are different requirements. So that would need to be considered from an expert point of view. In terms of flooding, to my knowledge, it's not in a flood area. If it was in a flood area, that could have a significant impact. While you can build commercial and community facilities within flood areas, that can again impact on the design and impact on the way in which the scheme is actually built. But to my knowledge, it's not, no.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Hadcraft.
Okay. I think you're working on a lot of false premises, and I find it very difficult to comment on not knowing how much it's going to cost, what your building costs are going to be, what you really want to plan to put there. I think that you really need to find out what the electorate wants. I find it very difficult to believe that 43% of the electorate wants an education centre there. I don't know where those figures come from. And if anybody had been looking at social media, there are a lot of other plans that the electorate wanted rather than an educational centre. I think also it's a false premise to go along with Engleton Woods. The whole of the electorate really didn't like the plan for Station Yard. They don't like the architecture. And I think it's wrong to go with the plans that Engleton would make. And I think you really need an integrated approach to decide what you want to do based on what the hell is going on with Station Yard, which nobody seems to know. And I think we all need to know more about the financing if you're going to spend a lot of public money. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Well, we've got this recorded, John, and Town Clerk's taking copious notes, so all those comments are noted. Thank you. Right, I'm back to my list. Katie Flooding. Katie Flooding, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, would you like to ask a question, Katie?
Well, I was going to ask a couple of questions, but Jonathan Hardcraft has just answered that one. Very, very important indeed. And Val Conway answered about...
Remind me, Katie, which one was that, please, just for the record?
Oh gosh, it was, we Mr. Hardcroft went back to the proposal for the garage and the contamination and the town valley aspect there. So that question has been answered. And then the second thing I was going to ask about was about the flood area and contamination, and both questions have been answered. So I'm happy with that.
Fine, thank you. And Mr. Burdett, Ridley, are you wishing to ask a question? You'll have to unmute yourself. That's fine.
My main concern, it's not really a question, my main concern is if some form of station yard development goes ahead, if this goes ahead, the volume of borrowing that the council will be involved in, never mind present interest rates, never mind what can be negotiated, these things change. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I wonder how much the present government's attitude to planning, which seems to be to encourage a little bit more of a, I daren't call it a free for all, but certainly a free for some people, will affect how much the PCC feels they need to worry about what they do with the site. And my third concern is that if there is a need for an environmental study centre, and if that is the principal use, frankly, we have a large, and this will, I presume, need residential attachments to make it worthwhile. And I think if I remember, that was what the geography study thing was going on about, was it not? About the fact they needed to have somewhere for people to stay. You've got St. Felix up the road, screaming for courses to run, no doubt, during their slack periods. Otherwise, can I just congratulate Val Conway on an extremely good presentation.
Well, thank you for those words. David Burrows, yes, Jess, can I get David in first? Or no, you want to answer Ridley directly, do you?
But he's got a couple of questions that are worth.
Yes, come on then, and then I'll bring David in.
I want to come back to this whole issue of its use as an environmental learning center. That was simply for a very, putting forward that use was for a very limited situation, establishing a value that will enable us to start the bidding process.
No, I do, excuse me, I do realize that.
Oh, okay.
So supposing that's not what you do, what are you going to use it for?
Okay, so once, this again is a key.
Sorry, I'm not a Southwold ratepayer, so it's not my money, but it's somebody's.
Okay, so let me just carry on. That any community use and any housing use, any use that's permitted by our neighborhood plan and planning policy can and should be considered once, if and when the land is acquired. But you can't do anything until you acquire the land.
I appreciate that. But the value put upon the land will depend upon the value, upon the purpose that you say you're going to use it for. And the purpose you say you're going to use it for is going to set the costs, income, differences that contribute to the valuation of the land, do they not?
Well, let me turn it over to Val to address that, because that's one of the things that we did discuss. And then also to address changing planning policies and how this might affect the process.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. The use does determine how much net income you're going to get and how much you can afford. But by having a community use you can look at and say, well, this can generate about this much money, gives you an understanding of what is possible and what is the art of the capable. Thankfully, the planning policy is actually fairly flexible in that there are opportunities to mix uses to make a community use as viable as it needs to be. Now, what we've got is a position where we understand broadly a community use that could be viable, that frames the ability to open negotiations within a predetermined time frame that we have to meet, so we need to get on with this. If we end up reaching agreement, that agreement is going to reflect not just your views, but the views of the PCC as to what they're prepared to accept and what they can justify again, from the public purse point of view. Now that number, once we've got that number, if we get to a number, we'll be able to look at that number and say, realistically, does this community use support that number? Could any other community use support that number? Because it gives you an understanding that a community use can support a number. If the number is so big, it's never going to be supported by a community use, then that's the point at which you say, we can agree XD pounds, but actually it's not realistic. But we do need to start that bidding process now. So yes, it is an iterative process. It isn't ideal, but it is where we are, and it does give us a framework within which to try to secure the site and understand what can then be delivered that supports that number before finalising the spending of any money. In terms of the government attitude to planning policy, you're absolutely right. This is a very, very tricky situation in that at the moment, the site and the use of the site is such that there are not any permitted development rights for its change of use automatically, which there are for some other uses under current planning, recently introduced changes by this government. We also have the planning white paper, which has proposed a completely alternative approach to the planning system. And it may be that the PCC decide to sit and wait, which would not be beneficial to the community. And I think there's a discussion to be had with them as a public body about the benefit to the community that this land can offer, and whether or not it's actually a good thing for them to be seen not to be supporting their local community. But they could sit on it for 5 years. We don't know how long it's going to take for the outcome of the planning white paper to change the planning situation. And we don't know whether that is going to change the planning permission situation for this particular use. So that is a big degree of uncertainty for the PCC, but you're absolutely right. The context is a complicated one. I hope that helps.
It does. I mean, the fact that the phrase pigs and pokes does come into my mind at this point. But I think I've probably had my ration. I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Ridley. I've got 3 more people that I've identified before I start saying, let's go round again and wave to me and I'll bring you in. Bunty, did you wish to ask a question? David Burrows.
Just a quick one, maybe include up on this, but for instance, if the PCC decides to retain the site, I was just interested to see as an asset of community value. I mean, while it sits there, does that stop us as a community, you know, working with them to actually, until they make a decision to use the site? Is there restrictions, or will they, you know, as an asset of community value, what does that mean with regards to us being able to use the site for a community project in the time of, you know, in that interim time?
Excellent, thank you. Do you want to take that one, Val?
Yes. You could certainly have a discussion with them about whether you could use the site in the interim, but I would question whether or not the existing building is a particularly suitable building. It is of its time, and the nature of it as a former police station may have limitations. It doesn't mean it wouldn't have a community use that could be of value. You would need to negotiate separately, if you can't buy it, whether or not you lease it on a short-term basis from the PCC, and that would limit what you could do. I would be highly surprised if they would want you to develop it in any way or change it in any way for community use, or if you did, it would be at your risk with no ongoing certainty that you would be able to get the best value out of any money you spent on it over the long term, because it would only be a short-term interest if they were to let you have it until such time as they make their mind up. But it certainly isn't out of the question to have that discussion.
Just the concern is with some of the buildings in that same area, which obviously you're going to be working on at some point, is having another building which is going to be empty and, you know, potentially derelict for how long? I mean, it just doesn't give a good, you know, as you come into Southwold, you know, it just doesn't give a good feel. You know, all these buildings are in sort of prime view as you're coming in. Yep. So it's interesting if there was.
I agree.
If there was a period of time where it can be used suitably for the community, well, then it's an option, isn't it?
yeah, I think it would be foolish not to use it for something in the interim anyway, and even to negotiate with the police. Wendy Green, do you want to ask a question? We've got a muting problem as well, Wendy.
Thank you very much, but I don't want to ask any questions at the moment.
Right, fine. James Mellish, I've just spotted you there, but I was sort of putting you in another parcel of the meeting. Anything you want to ask, James?
There you go. So I was just unmuting myself. Yeah, well, having listened, I think the couple of questions I had have already been answered. In particular, sort of seeding investment where it makes the the proposition viable, and that's obviously something that needs to be considered and looked at. Was my first question, but also, the on costs of any further survey work, contamination, etc. I think would need to be considered in terms of development. But from a project point of view, I think it sounds very promising, and certainly some of the feedback I've had on some of the projects I've been working on in Southwold is that this type of facility, a community-based facility, is has got a lot of potential there. So.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mr. and Mrs. Hemming, we didn't hear you earlier. Would you like to rectify that then, please, and ask a question?
The police station site. We're not talking about the fire station site as well.
No, the fire station site has gone, Pam. It's just the police station site that we've got the asset of community value on. Yeah. Okay, Nigel.
If I may just say that it sounds as if there isn't any business numbers that you can put your finger on. And I believe you need to do that before you make any suggestions. What sort of income can you get out of an environmental centre? I would suggest it might be somewhat limited.
Yep. Okay. Val, do you want to address the general question there rather than the specifics, please?
The potential income generation capability has been looked at separately, and a report has been looked at on that confidentially, because that informs our views on negotiations and negotiating positions. So that is commercially sensitive and confidential at the moment. Just to say that a lot of work has been done in assessing the various markets for the various elements of use that such a facility could offer, the ones that we looked at in the presentation, the types of use, how much income they could generate, taking into account things like the amount of time the centre would be used, etc., and taking into account things like the running costs. So yes, that's been assessed by Moss King Associates, and they've looked at that in quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, pleased to hear that.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I think I've been round the room as best I can see, but if you'd like to ask anything generally, will you raise a hand and I'll bring you in. I've got William Hancock and Ian Small and Catherine Kirk. Catherine, let's take you first, if I may, please.
Right, I'm unmuted. In terms of the designation of community facility, does that include the possibility of sheltered care for the elderly, or a care home, or any other supported living possibility for individuals that need that, or that might be frail, etc.?
Jess, I think that's one for you.
I actually think it's one for Val, because that's a complex, Catherine, that's a complex planning issue. And I'd like to kick that over to Val, because I think Val has a more sophisticated understanding than I do of this issue. What do you think, Val? Could these could residential accommodation for elderly people or people with disabilities?
It's a very specialist area. It's also a very difficult question because it would depend on whether or not that facility was run for the benefit of the community or whether it was run as a private operation, because an awful lot of care accommodation and accommodation supporting elderly and less able people is actually run as a private enterprise. Now, if it was a private enterprise, that would be a private sector development and would not fall within what I would consider would tick the boxes for an asset of community value. But if it was run as something for the community, or it had some of that use that was ancillary to a community use, it might. I think the difficulty is for a centre of that nature, for a particular development of that nature, the site is actually too small. Having worked on a number of developments of that style for the private sector, providing supported living for older people and people with special needs, they actually need a lot more land than that. And actually, I think the site's a little bit small for that. But that was the most difficult question, I think. Thank you for that.
Oh, all right with that, Catherine?
Yep. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's
Ian Small.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I mean, obviously, throughout this whole conversation, it hasn't really been stated, but I would state it obviously now, which is the whole point of putting an offer in at this stage would be in line with the neighbourhood plan to effectively stop what the neighbourhood plan is about, which is a building directly opposite this site developed by market forces and being sold on the highest bidder. So, I mean, that's pretty clear. And if that is the objective, there's something within the presentation that I just would like some clarity on, if we can. When we talk about the asset of community value, it was mentioned that there was a 5-year window, possibly 10-year window, and a 20-year window. These may be lacking association, but there was a little bit of confusion over that. The point about someone coming in and potentially sitting on this land beyond 5, 10, 20 years, is there an opportunity for someone to just sit on it for 5 years? That's a short window. That's quite attractive.
Val, can I hand that one over to you, knowing that you'll probably pass it on to Jess anyway, but having got it wrong first time round or last time round, can we do it the other way around now?
I'll start. I'm sure Jess will correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
The designation of an asset for community value lasts for an initial period of 5 years, but can then be repeated for another 5 years. So you could be looking at 10 years, and it could then be renewed again, but it's very unlikely because very few of them end up being 15-year opportunities. I think generally if it hasn't moved into a community use properly within the first 10 years, it is a bit unlikely, although theoretically it could go on for another 5. So the asset of community value designation could carry on for 10 years, it could end in 5 years. However, the neighbourhood plan is a different matter altogether. Neighbourhood plan policies, once adopted, and if they form part of the local plan, they would remain in place for the plan period, unless there's a review that changes them, which would be a different process altogether, but they would be there for the plan period, and that's intended to be around 18 years. So the planning policies within the neighbourhood plan are separate from the asset of community value designation. Both of them together impact on the ability for somebody else to develop this site. It's almost sort of belt and braces.
Separate running in parallel.
Separate running in parallel, absolutely.
Right.
So after 5 years, somebody might get lucky and say, well, look, it hasn't happened. Come on, let's change this and make a big case. If it has happened, it's gone anyway. But there is a possibility that they would have to wait 18 years once those policies are firmly in place in an adopted planning document.
I just think the final point is one that Bunty, that David mentioned, is the impact of the visual impact of this site versus and associated with the station yard. It is a aesthetic challenge for a town that's struggling to attract people at times. So I think it's a really important that the design itself is, if this does go ahead, is particularly key.
Yep, fine. All right, thank you very much. Jess, did you want to come in after Val there?
The only thing I would like to say is I would urge everyone here who is a member of the public to write into Leslie an email saying that you support our neighborhood plan policies, okay, on housing, because they're out for consultation, and all of this depends upon our plan being adopted.
Yep, if I can just show you, it's that little A5 sheet that is available at Town Hall. Right. Okay, Bill Hancock.
Thank you, Ian.
Sorry, I've left you a long time.
Oh, that's okay. I've been sat here sweating. No, I think I know the answer to this anyway, because I think it's just been covered off, but I'll ask anyway. Alternative bids, where would you see the threat? Hopefully not from an 8 till late, which could that be classified as a community asset? A supermarket, small supermarket. Would that be classified? Really a question for yourself, Val. Could they come in and argue that they're doing something for the community? I know it's a commercial venture. It was just a bit of off the wall question, really.
They could suggest it, but retail is a commercial use, and regardless of who the occupier is, that would effectively be a retail use and a commercial use rather than a community use.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, Bill?
No, I'm fine.
Right, is there anybody else?
By the way, Val, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to come in, because we're sort of getting toward the end, or I can feel there's an end in sight. Anybody else who'd like to say anything before I wrap it up?